Welcome, folks, to the show. It is Counter Clipping show number 115 for March 13th, 2023. And I once again put the date in my notes as 2323. Apparently, it would be nice to have a time machine. So that's great. Today's topic is the best of the SPI soapboxes. We're going to talk a little bit about SPI formats, at least introduce that format. And then we will do all the other business that the show usually has. So we are clipping the Russian Campaign Deluxe 5th Edition, newly arrived from GMT. Shout out to John Krantz, who saw to it that I received a copy. So thank you, John, if you are watching. So that was nice. And I'm pretty impressed with it. We're going to try and get this to a table at some point this year, although it's not going to happen all that soon, considering that we have a rather full itinerary ahead of us for the next couple of months anyway. So, but it has been on my to-play list, as we discussed in a previous show, for some time. We are drinking Laphroaig 10-year. This is one of my personal favorites. It is bottled at 43%, which is amenable. It is heavily peated. Those who don't like peated scotch should stay clear of Laphroaig. So there's a TikTok channel I watch that's like a bourbon guy. And he's like, I hate scotch. It tastes terrible. And then he's like drinking Ardbeg, which is not exactly your introductory scotch. Now, I like Ardbeg, but it's not necessarily on my favorites. But if you're looking for an introductory scotch, I recommend Macallan. If you the regular Macallan 12-year, which is not the cheapest stuff, it's almost $100 a bottle here in Ohio now, which is crazy. But if you can get it for a decent price, it's a good choice. Or if you can't, maybe Balvenie 12 Doublewood, which is one of the things that we had at Winterfest and that I was finishing off last week. So before we get into the stuff, let me mention that you should all like the video, subscribe to the channel if through some unhappy mischance you are not already. My throat's already going bad. Not already subscribed. Big shout out to the patrons of Ardwulf's Lair. In particular, that reminds me to put the ticker up. This has been great that I'm actually remembering this. So big shout out to new swordsman patrons Jeff Anderson, Dan Dolan, and big shout out to new hero patron Rick Cox, who I may have thanked last week, but I'm cool with it if I thank somebody twice. So it's all good. So that is going well. I guess I'll mention that I uploaded some corrected 3D models for one of the counter trays. So if you are downloading those, make sure you get the new ones. They are marked as V2, the ones that got revised. There was a small but critical design flaw that came up when I started trying to organize case blue in them. That is an ongoing project, which I hope to have finished in the next few days, but we will actually see. So super chats and super stickers are on. That support is also much appreciated. And just as a general reminder, if you like the content that any given YouTube person is putting out, it really does help to support their channel to, be there for the streams and participate in the chats and thumbs up the videos and subscribe and all that stuff. If you'd like to do something more directly, there's a link to the Patreon in the notes below. An interesting thing about Russian Campaign here, and you'll see this in the unboxing video, which will be out on Thursday, is that they give you parallel sets of markers for the armored units, which are pretty much core. It's pretty much a core level game. Core and army, I guess, for the Soviets. They give you two sets of counters. They give you one with NATO symbols and one with silhouettes, which is nice for those people who want silhouettes. Personally, I don't care. I'll just be happy with the NATO symbols, but I'd have been happy with the silhouettes if that's what they came with. But if you got room on the sheets, so we will try to be happy with what we got here. So so Jeff, we'll be talking about we did not miss that one. I might have missed one, but I did not miss that one. So before we get any further, let's shout out to Alan Salazar, Alistair Logie, Bill Simoni, Bob Kowalczyk, Brent McCabe, Charles Latour, Dale Brady, Ed Holtzman, Farshad Niazi, HUN 644. The legend himself, Fucko, is in the house. Jeff Anderson, Jeff Beeler, Joe Okabayashi, Joe Perez, Joel, John Longshore is here. John Stanley, John C. from the sunny Philippines, John Clark, Carl Crater from the Wargame Boot Camp, Matt Taylor, Meandering Mike, Patrick of Patrick's Tactics and Tutorials, Perfidious Albion, Ray Garby, Rick Cox, Stacking Limit, Stigler is here. I'm very happy to see you here, Stigler. Tim Greenhaw, Vicky, William Aarons, and William Boardman. And I know I missed some people because Tim Statler is here, Iggy Krichtal is here, because it runs people off. Richard Coker is here, McFudpucker is here. David Thompson, thanks for stopping by. Alan Salazar, if I didn't get you. Pizza Frenzy Man, Jack P. There's tons of people here. Mark McNair, if I didn't get you. So tonight we're going to be talking about SPI. And specifically, we're going to be talking about the soapbox format. And I'm gonna do the introduction to the soapbox format, and then I'm gonna do the Wargaming news, which should be relatively quick because I want this fucking stuff out of my way. So the standard SPI packaging scheme for many years was what we now call the SPI flat. That's this thing. John Longshore, thank you so much. Much appreciated. This is it's a plastic blow molded tray with a cardboard backing, which is invariably detached because the glue has disintegrated in the last 50 years, with a strange, odd-sized cover sheet. I'm not a huge fan of this packaging. I'm on the record as being not a huge fan of this packaging. There are a few games that I am willing to deal with it. Late in the 70s, I want to say around 77, 78, might have been as early as 76, they started producing games in boxes, which had been the standard for Avalon Hill for a long time. Most of those were relatively conventional boxes. They did some like 1-inch boxes. They did some 2-inch boxes. Their bigger games, however, came out in what we now call the soapbox, the SPI soapbox. This is a 4-inch box. These, as far as I know, all came with counter trays. I think Jeff Beeler mentioned that they usually came with 2, but I think some of them came with more, like War in Europe, War in the Pacific may have come with more. And nowadays, this would be pretty overkill for packaging, to be honest. The only examples of this kind of packaging that I'm aware of anymore are a couple of things from DVG, including, am I getting this right? Yeah, including Field Commander Napoleon, which I have, and which you can't actually see on the shelf behind me. I'm in the midst of reorganizing shelving here. And GMT, which did Pacific War in one of these, and will be doing the last expansion for Space Empires 4X in one of those. So it's a format that has acquired to some degree of romance. Let's put it that way. Oh, I wouldn't call it pristine. It is punched and it is in pretty good shape. So I'm not complaining. And I haven't had a chance to check it yet for being complete, but it was a reasonable price, but not incredibly inexpensive. Let's put it that way. Am I putting these in the wrong stacks? Yes, I am. I will be sorting out the counters with symbols and putting those in a baggie. It is kind of an odd packaging choice, but at the same time, these were games that were mostly bigger than anybody else was doing. There are exceptions to that. DDW, for example, had some really big games. And you may recall that Avalon Hill had one game in a very unusual format, The Longest Day, which was in a flat box, but it was a 2-inch flat box. I'm not aware that they did anything else in that 2-inch flat box format. So Operation Typhoon looks pretty cool. We'll talk about it as we go here. So let me get to the Wargaming news. There is a Kickstarter up. There are links to all of this in the video description, by the way, for Song for War. That's the Invicta Rex games guys. They are pretty cool guys. They will be with us at Origins once again, showing their very nice looking game off. They keep calling it it's Axis and Allies on steroids, and I think that's I think that's underselling it a little bit. It strikes me as more sophisticated than at least regular Axis and Allies, but it's World War II in the Mediterranean. It's not a historical simulation, but it's a lot of fun, and I recommend folks give it a look. So the link to the Kickstarter, which is live now, is in the video description. So we have 3 upcoming events that are relevant, and I'm not even going to mention Origins because that's a ways out yet, although I just mentioned Origins. So we've got the SD HistCon Spring Deployment. That is an online convention that is March 18th, which is this Saturday. I'm not sure how much I will be able to participate, but I will be there at least for the closing wrap-up show. So that should be broadcast later on. So check that out when it happens. Also coming up is the Circle DC event. This is in Washington, D.C. It is March 31st to April 2nd. There's a link to this in the video description as well. This is a pretty recently announced event. There's some big shots are going to be there, so check that out. You might also avail yourself of the many things of historical interest that there are to do in Washington, D.C. while you are there. And lastly, we have Buckeye Game Fest, which is April 24th to the 40th. Finally made my hotel reservation for that. We will be playing Labatide in Mont Saint Jean all week. It sounds as though we are using the Marie Louise rules, but there will be at least 2 and plausibly 3 tables of Labatide running at Buckeye Game Fest. So it is going to be something of a Labatide fest. There's also going to be at least an OCS table. The guys from Players Aid are going to be there again. So they will be doing a bunch of assorted things, including probably some more coin things, large format coin things. John, I'm pretty sure I've never owned the Longest Day, and I've never taken a tape measure to it, so I'm willing to be corrected, but I'm pretty sure that's a 2-inch high box. I'd be happy to be wrong on that. Lord knows that there's enough stuff in there to warrant a even bigger box. So David Thompson will be at SD HistCon, Circle DC, and the Buckeye Game Fest, and he is super excited about all 3. David, thanks very much. We look forward to seeing you and the other folks there as well. Just making sure I'm not mixing the icon units up here. There's nothing wrong with the icon units. I just want them set aside. That's all. John C. says that he'd never heard of SPI until his cousin got War in the East. Well, this War in the East will be one we do talk about today, since it was released. It's the only game that's part of 2 soapboxes. Let me put it that way. And I'll maybe need to clarify that statement later on down the line. I own 4 SPI soapboxes: War in the Pacific, War in Europe, which of course includes War in the East and War in the West, Operation Typhoon, and Atlantic Wall. The one I kind of still want is, and I keep saying this incorrectly, but Wacht am Rhein, because I keep saying something stupid like, oh, that's the only World War II one I still need. That's not true. There's Highway to the Reich and there's Campaign for North Africa, neither of which am I willing to pay the going rate for. If I've got an eBay search going for Highway to the Reich, if I find one in good shape, that's a price I would like to pay, considering that it's not going to get played, then I will consider buying it. But that is if that deal never falls into my lap, that's okay too. Bloody April was, well, we're going to talk about all of these. There were 18 soapbox games as far as I am able to tell. That numbering's a little weird, and I'm going to give dates on these because I'm going to do them in chronological order, and then I'll tell you at the end what my top 5, my personal top 5 are. And I own 4 of them, so that ought to tell you something. The dates are going to be a little screwy because they're the BGG dates. I wasn't able to look up everything, and in some cases the game was released. In most of these cases, actually, the games were also released in the flat trays, and not solely in the soapbox. But at least a couple of these were released only in the soapbox, and we'll see if we can correctly identify those when we come across them. So first of all, I'd like to confirm, since Stigler is here, I'd like to confirm the authenticity of an image that has come across the news desk here at Ardwulf's Lair. This seems to show Stigler at the Decision Games booth at some convention, holding, taking stock of a number of fine titles, such as History of Decision, Making SPI Classics Better, and Final Decision, Why Games with 5 Rule Sets Simply Make Sense. So I would like to thank our intrepid roving reporters here. Adam, thank you very much for providing this news to me. So before we get to the we merely report the news here at Ardwulf's Lair. So I guess I'll take the opportunity to leave this gem up and talk about what's going on gaming wise over here. We resumed play of Blitzkrieg last week. We finished December 21st, I believe, was the turn that we finished. December 22nd, of course, is the turn where like 10 American divisions and a ton of artillery show up. So we'll see how that affects the game. We did add a fourth player, which is nice, and which is now that he is up to speed and fully participating, is really speeding things up very much. The the uh, the the other thing is we're prepping for La Bataille de Mont Saint Jean at Buckeye Game Fest. We will, of course, be running Third World War at Origins as well. And I hope everybody who is interested in the 3D printed storage solutions checked out the 3D printed storage solutions video for Third World War, because I'm real happy with it. So let's move on, and I'm going to do these in alphabetical order, actually. Because there isn't a better order, and that created problems, and you'll see where. So anyway, let's see. Yep, is that working? Yes. Okay, so alphabetically, the first of the soapboxes is Atlantic Wall. This is a 1978 released by Joe Balkowski. I am not sure that I personally have seen this in the flat. It may have released in the flat, but I don't recall ever seeing it. And it's kind of date wise, it seems to kind of be on the edge. Um, so, so this is a game about D-Day, and it covers pretty much, as I recall, pretty much to the end of June 1944. So it's not like the updated fine game from Decision Games, their Atlantic Wall, which is a completely different game. And which covers through very late August, actually. This only covers through about June. Doing this from memory because I didn't look inside the box before I did this, but I want to say it's 5 maps. And it is it's an interesting game. It does There are like signs if you start looking at the rules where some of the starting places for, and I think this is true of the SPI Vac Dam Rhine as well. Some of the starting places for the modern Gauss system, which is the sort of descendant of this, but really only in game titles. Um, you could tell that some of the mechanical inspiration, some of the basic roots were inspired by these original games from SPI. This, of course, Joe Balkowski design. Joe Balkowski, if you don't know, has written a large number of books on American forces in Normandy. He's working on another one. He is the official historian of the U.S. 29th Infantry Division. So it goes without saying that those are fairly impressive credentials. So Joe knows what he's talking about when it comes to D-Day stuff. There's like several different shades of green for the Axis forces here, and I'm kind of having a bitch of a time distinguishing between them. So I think this is one of the more interesting ones that's in the oops, that didn't belong there. That's in the SPI catalog among the soapboxes. There are some obscure ones here too, and we'll talk about each of those. Like I said, I'm not sure that we're going to look here. I'm not sure that Atlantic Wall came out in the flat tray. I don't recall ever seeing it. That doesn't mean it didn't. So next up is Bloody April. Now this is a 1979 release by Richard Berg. About all I know, here's what I know about this. It is one of the, or is related to the great battles of the American Civil War system. Okay, so it's the direct descendant of Terrible Swift Sword, which we will get to in the fullness of time. It's probably Fucko. It's probably the light in here more than anything. In fact, does this screw things up? Not too bad. That'll help. The light in here is not great. It's design. It's lighting that's good for the filming me and not necessarily for clip encounters. We're working on that. Several solutions have presented themselves. Jeff Beeler, cut and paste, has gone awry, I'm afraid. But Jeff does say soapbox only, which jives with my recollection. Bloody April, as I recall, also only appeared in the soapbox. I've never seen it in the flat. Now, my understanding is that this compares less favorably than Terrible Swift Sword does. Okay, and it was never redone, unlike Terrible Swift Sword, which was redone by TSR, and then later completely reimagined by Berg over at GMT under the title 3 Days of Gettysburg. Bloody April was never redone, and it was in fact completely redesigned using the new GBACW system under the title Into the Woods, which I have expressed my belief that that's not an awesome title, but apparently that's the title Berg wanted, and I guess that's got to be good enough for us. So if you're interested in Shiloh, which is a really interesting Civil War battle and a really important Civil War battle, um, I'd recommend looking it Into the Woods before I'd recommend running this down. I will say that the complexity level on these old GBACW games is generally lower than in the new GBACW system. But I think to my taste, I'd rather play the new system. Now, I have historical interest in the old system as well. I don't own any of the Civil War stuff, but back in the day when I said I don't have any Civil War games, I did actually, and a couple of them were GPACW games from SPI. So I never played any of them back in the day, but this was not one of them. I've never owned this or Terrible Swift Sword. So next up is the legendary, and to some legendarily bad, although I'm less convinced of that than a lot of people are, Campaign for North Africa, a 1979 release designed by Richard Berg. And this one I can definitively say was not released in a flat tray. This was another soapbox only. Now, my understanding here is, and I've really only done very little with this other than to glance at the rules, and to kind of glance at the components. The components are really quite nice for a 1979 game. I believe we have Redmond Simonson to thank for that, so that shouldn't surprise anybody. I expect, and I've said this before, but I'll say it again for those who didn't catch it before. Bob Kowalczyk asks, let me address this because Mark asked me this too. Yes, and it's my fault that my schedule has just been horrendous for the last several months. We would like to get back to it. On the other hand, we did, I think, give a fairly decent introduction to Pacific War in the video that we did over on Fred's channel. I'm pretty sure that was on Fred's channel and not over here. Obviously, I'd like to do it because it'd be great content for my channel too. Shit. Stacking Limit has shown me the error of my ways. We have missed the Art of Siege. So the Art of Siege, I'm not prepared for this. So damn it, I missed one. So this is a quad for which there is another one of those quads that there's a fifth game. And it's a quad that came in a soapbox. And I think it's the only quad that came in a soapbox, but there's a couple near exceptions that we'll see in a minute. So there's 4 games in the box, and it's really unique in its choice of subject matter. It's several different sieges. And we don't see a lot of war games generally about siege warfare. So it's an interesting pick, and I'll pull the image up later in the show because I don't have it ready to go. So I actually alphabetized correctly, unlike Excel, which alphabetized things incorrectly, which is why I had to make some corrections after the fact in the show prep stage. Oops. Okay, so thank you, Stacking Limit, for mentioning Art of Siege, because I did forget about it, and I'm not prepared for it now, damn it, because it wasn't included in my show prep. So that means there's 19 quads, by the way. All right, so next up is possibly the most obscure one, and for a long time the most valuable one, and definitely the rarest one. This is Conflicts in American History, the Civil War Module 1. There was no Module 2. What this is it's a big pack of war games intended for classroom use to teach American history, and it includes two games which are out of the same games that are out of the blue and gray quads. So Cemetery Hill, which is obviously Cemetery Hill during Gettysburg. Um, this box was released in 1979. I have physically seen a copy of this, by the way, and this obviously was only in the Soapbox. Um, the system for these had some people in multiple people involved, and I found it difficult without running additional information down to figure out who was the series designer versus who were the game designers. So Antietam was designed by Tom Walchuk, and Cemetery Hill was designed by Ed Curran, and those both of those released in 1975. And then this big package, I believe, came with 4 copies of each of those, plus additional classroom specific material. Now, I think this is a really interesting thing. Buck Commander 1983, thanks for coming. It's always good to have you here. Um, I don't know that the subject of using games in a pedagogical way to teach subjects, to teach classroom subjects, is a thing that really came up very often, um, until relatively recently. But here we are with SPI anticipating that in 1979. So once again, SPI proved really prophetic in their choice of products. And again, pretty interesting product. Obviously, if you want the games, you're much better off running down copies of Blue and Gray or Blue. They're both in Blue and Gray one. But Noble Knight has one of these listed, and it's like $1,500, and I didn't even look at what the condition was. So, um, can you get it cheaper? Maybe, but like I said, it's also quite rare. So, only for the true collector. If you want the games, just go get a copy of Blue and Gray, which has a couple of different versions. Was done in a flat by SPI. I believe there's a box version by SPI. Was redone by TSR. Was later redone by Decision. So not a Blue and Gray is not a hard item to find. This, on the other hand, is very rare. I got this, but I missed Art of Siege. Next up is Highway to the Reich. Now, this was a 1977 release. This was an original design. There's 2 editions of it. There's 3 editions. One's from Decision. The first 2 editions were from SPI, and as far as I'm able to tell, they were both released in 1977. The original design is by Jay Nelson. Developer was Irad B. Hardy. And the sort of designer or lead or whatever you want to say on the revision was Eric Goldberg. So this is a game that rather famously has some significant problems. It's a game about Operation Market Garden. I believe it's 3 or 5 maps or something like that. It would be neat to have for historical interest, but it is not a game I would recommend putting a lot of effort into running down. Should you encounter it at a garage sale for $10, by all means, but which is pretty much my wish list criteria on this, to be completely honest. If I run across it at a very attractive price, I might grab it, but otherwise, I'm not gonna lose any sleep over not grabbing it. I have several games on Operation Market Garden, several of them excellent, verifiably excellent. I don't need this historical curiosity. Now, this was redone by Decision, and it is another one of those. These always require explanations. And this was available in the flat, by the way, uh, in both the first and second edition. The Soapbox version is the second edition. So I lost my train of thought. So it's probably the Scotch, which I unfortunately have not been drinking all day, thankfully. Right. Um, Stigler, you should make that video. I would be very interested in seeing that. So I can't really tell you exactly, I cannot clearly enumerate the reported problems with it. Let me put it that way, which, even though I haven't played, there's a number of these I haven't played. Most of these I haven't played. But I can tell you what at least some of the big problem highlights are for a couple of them. So the decision version, which is where I was trying to go, and see, it flew right out of my head because it's the decision version, is another one of these SPI redos that basically changes nothing, inherits all the problems of the original, tries to clean a couple of very minor things up and screws those up and introduces new problems. So, unless you're strictly in it for the graphical upgrades and would like it as a kit from which you can develop a good market garden game, not recommended. So, um, but that said, noble effort on the part of the people that were involved because this was the first big market garden game. William Byrd is this is definitely not happening. Um, well, I guess I shouldn't say that, but if this is happening, I haven't heard about it. What Compass is publishing is a new game called World War II Commander Market Garden, which is a John Butterfield game, very similar to his World War II Commander Battle of the Bulge from a couple of years ago. Um, it is conceivable that some of these rights have drifted over the years, but I'm on these 19 games specifically, I'm not aware that that has happened. So so Tim Sale says they don't have rights to SPI games, and that's generally true. There may be some exceptions, but remember, Decision doesn't have them all either. Um, some of them reside with Excalibur Games, and at some point, I would like to revisit, researching that in my copious free time. You know what I'm saying? Abraxas MF asks if Compass is doing Hell's Highway. No, that is New England Simulations. We'll be releasing a new version of Hell's Highway, and that might even be next after Winter's Victory comes out. Winter's Victory I have ordered, by the way. Um, Stigler, they made an attempt to save it with predictable results. They fixed some things, but then introduced other problems with their own design. And of course, that would be the kind of thing that playtesting would turn out. But that's funny. Um, so Mo from Mo's Game Table is here. Pete Bartlett, thanks for coming by as well. All right, so we've bitched about Highway to the Reich enough. Let's move on to. I can't tell you a lot about this because this is one I never had, one I never looked at, a topic I'm not interested in. This is Mech War 2. So this is a dual pack, if you will, of two games that were released separately, at least in folios or ziplocs or something, or flats or something like that. I've personally never seen a copy of Suez the Golan on its own, but I have seen Red Star, White Star. So these games are both available individually, and there's pretty cool cover on Red Star, White Star, by the way. And a less amazing cover on Suez the Golan. There's some contrast issues here. So this is so it's modern mechanized combat. Okay. It's essentially tactical or grand tactical. And Red Star, White Star is modern hypothetical content combat in Europe, where Suez de Golan is pretty much the historical Arab-Israeli war. So it's an interesting mix of topics that mixes both hypothetical and actually historical topics in the same box. Um, and all of this, by the way, is designed by Mark Herman. I didn't look in the credits on these, but he's the sole credited person. You really got to take what's listed on BGG with a grain of salt on this stuff, by the way. So independently verify where possible, because I identified a number of things that were deceptive in the listings on BGG, and some of the pictures aren't that great either. So the big box though is Mech War 2, and all of these, by the way, are relatively pricey on the secondary market. Let me point that out. BGG is a tremendous resource. It's tremendously useful and valuable. Don't get me wrong. But when you're looking for specific details, verify the details. All right, next up is Mech War 2 is a 1979 release, by the way. Next up is NATO Division Commander, and this was also solely in the Soapbox. This is future history, August 1985. So this is, Cold War goes hot subject matter. Um, I don't know a lot about this one either. It is a Jim Dunnigan design. At least he's the sole, again, credited person over there too. This is an interesting statement on Stigler's part. Panzer Battles, which I do have, by the way, was an abortive attempt to retrofit Mech War 2 back to World War II. It should have worked, but they screwed the pooch by putting it in S&T. Now, I do know that they had intended that Panzer Battle system to be the start of a series, and that never really materialized. Doug says this is double blind. That's news to me, but again, I've never seriously looked at any of this Cold War Goes Hot. That's not quite true, but the majority of this Cold War Goes Hot stuff, and we'll talk about what I did see back in the day when we do the best of strategy and tactics, which we'll probably have to do in multiple episodes, and I'm reluctant to commit myself to another multi-episode saga at this time. The short version of that story is that one of the games that I had back in the day from the S&T subscription was the China War, which was an interesting. At the time, it was interesting to me. Now that topic is actually more interesting to me than, say, just topically this would be. This is, it's a Dunnigan design. There's probably something cool in here mechanically. And it's I've seen highly variable prices on a lot of these. Some of them go consistently really high. Campaign for North Africa goes consistently really high. Conflicts in American history goes consistently really high. War in Europe, War in the Pacific usually go quite high, but this one is kind of all over the map. Next up, this one I did have is The Next War. Now, the credits on this, I don't own it. I don't own this anymore, by the way. The credits on this are designed by Jim Dunnigan and development by Mark Herman. And where I have seen that kind of credit, I'm preferring to acknowledge both the designer and the developer, learning a little bit more about the way the S&T, the SPI development model worked. In a lot of these cases, it does appear that the lion's share of the actual work was done by what was at the time called the developer, but they did a lot of what I think today we would consider design work. If anybody has, I'll talk about this next week, actually, because I don't have the numbers in front of me. This is not how BGG lists it, but again, I didn't double check these from a physical copy. So that makes sense though, and I want to say the Stephen Donaldson credit is correct on that as well from memory. All right, so there are some really good ideas here in The Next War. And at least some of those ideas originated with Dunnigan. There's sort of I would call this an action point mechanic. I'm not sure what they're called in The Next War because it's been at least 15 years since I've owned this. Oops, that goes here. But essentially, and for those who would like a modern take on this, by the way, you can take a look at the 1985 series from Thin Red Line Games, starting with Under an Iron Sky. All their games are set in 1985, but I'm talking about the ones with 1985 in the title: Under an Iron Sky, Deadly Northern Lights, and Sacred Oil. Those are descendants, at least spiritual, and maybe a little more than that, of The Next War. So they had been playing The Next War for a long time. They eventually, modified it and modified it and modified it till it was kind of its own thing. And then they published it and then expanded on that. So essentially you've got this like pool of actions, and with the actions, you can do a variety of things. You can move, you can attack again if you want. So this is mechanically a very interesting game. It's also a pretty attractive game for the year, and this is again 1978, so it's pretty late period SPI. But I remember thinking it was very attractive at the time. Let me put it that way. Alan Salazar says this was Mark Herman's big career breakthrough game, got attention to the Pentagon. Mark has told that story, yes, and I don't want to retell it because it's Mark's story to tell. But basically, yeah, I think that's an act. I mean, again, from what Mark says, yeah, that's how it worked. I don't want to make it sound like I'm questioning that because it's I'm going to take Mark's word for that. But yeah, and if that's the case, hey, that's sweet, right? So uh this wasn't a game that I saw getting a lot of attention until relatively recently, like in the last 10 years or so. Um, so um, it does feel a little bit like this has undergone a bit of a renaissance, including some spiritual successor games as well. Hey, awesome! If you guys, oh, that's not bad. That's not bad at all. Unless you actually pooped in the box, that's a pretty good price. So I'm not looking up prices on any of these. They're all relatively expensive, but Mech War 2 is maybe not one of the more valuable ones. Um, Next is Objective Moscow, the death of Soviet communism. Now, this is like the China War, and this was also a soapbox only, by the way. Um, I'm actually not sure that's correct. I'm actually not sure that's correct. This came out in 1978, so the date is about right for that. But I'm now that as soon as I said it out loud, I started to question whether that was actually accurate or not. In any case, um, this is a modern hypothetical game where it's kind of the inverse of Invasion America. Instead, it's Invasion Soviet Union. And it's, I believe, on three big maps that cover the entire Soviet Union. And there's a variety of hypothetical scenarios in here where a worldwide alliance of basically everybody invades the Soviet Union. Or this, I think there's a Soviet Union collapses on its own and everybody invades to pick the pieces up type of situation. So there's a number of hypothetical scenarios in here that might prove to be fun. This is one of the more valuable soapboxes. I consistently see this go pretty high. And I generally, if I see an SPI soapbox on eBay, I will generally bookmark it, just kind of keep an eye on where it went, even where I have no desire whatsoever to actually own the thing. Jeff Beeler asked about Napoleon's Last Battles. That was not in a soapbox. That was a regular 2-inch box. Was also in the flat too, and is an all-time classic, but not a soapbox. This is in a soapbox. I have physically seen a copy of this in a soapbox. Stigler says 2.5, and without a tape measure and an SPI 2-inch box out here, I'm going to say I'm not going to have an argument about whether it was 2 or 2.5 inches. It seems to me like, damn it, don't have any war games in front of me. That's a 2-inch box. I think that's a 2-inch box. Objective Moscow might well disintegrate into a general nuclear exchange, but I don't know if that's actually the case or not. So yeah, this is basically accurate. I mean, literally everybody has found out that this is a really good idea to not get involved in a land war in Asia. All right, next up is Operation Typhoon. This is I didn't mention the designer of Objective Moscow, and if I would like somebody to correct me on this if I'm getting it wrong. Joe Angiolillo and Angiolillo, Joe Angiolillo. Maybe that's correct. And Joe Belkowski has on up here on Operation Typhoon has a sort of co-design credit as well. It's a bit weird the way it's credited actually. Objective Moscow was designed by Joe Angiolillo as well, developed by Phil Kosnet. So this is, it's part of that lineage of variable strength units that started apparently with Invasion America, continued through the best known example, I think, which is Panzer Guderian, and then to this, and from here it went to the Victory in the West system. Angiolillo. Okay, that's what Stigler says. I'm going to these are I should also mention that as Steve O mentions, thanks Steve for coming by. These are also sometimes referred to as detergent boxes. Um, what we mean by soapbox, I have a physical one. Let me hide this for a second so you can actually see it. We mean this large 4-inch, 4.5-inch box that SPI did back in the day. It is a almost unique format that basically nobody else has really tried to copy. Almost nobody else. Jeff Anderson says there needs to be a new term for soapbox. Doesn't translate to younger audiences. I gotta agree with you. But I don't know that I have a better title than that. I mean, remember that ultimately uh the descriptor is based on the packaging, right? And the packaging is less important than the contents of the game in virtually every case. So Frank says Angiello. Angiello. Okay. It could be that BGF is spelling that name wrong, and that is why I am confused by the spelling. So, so the system here is a little different than it is in the three Victory in the West games that they released in S&T. Those games are Operation Grenade, Patton's Third Army, and Sicily Race to Messina. Those are on my list of things to get done at some point. Not sure whether that's going to happen in 2023 or not. But it would be nice. Now, the topic here obviously is Operation Typhoon. Without looking at pulling the box out, I'm not sure I could tell you exactly when this scenario starts and when this scenario ends. Logically, that should run from about September 1941 to about the end of January 1942. So that's how I might run to February or March actually to give the Soviets a little more chance to push back. If I were designing a game on this topic, and I have played games on this topic, but I haven't played this. And frankly, the one I'm likely to get on a table is probably Patton's Third Army. Horrible cover or not. Apparently, there's a story about that cover, by the way. Um, so Joe Perez says that the original art department mock-up of the Typhoon box cover had a Mark IV with a long barrel. He noticed it and was never so terrified as when he went into Redmond's office to tell him, "Oh dear, oh dear." Detergents are generally not sold in big boxes like that anymore. That's absolutely right. So, I mean, a lot of times they're sold in bags now. So the Star Force trilogy is the next one, and there's several interesting things about this. Now, in a couple of cases, the Soapbox game reprints or collects some previously published games. We'll see another example of that shortly here. But the big one that the two that we've seen that happen with so far was Conflict in American History, which was several years later redid Cemetery Hill and Antietam, both of which were available in little folios. Um, and then Mech War 2, but all three of those games, Mech War 2 and the two games that came inside, all have the same publication date, as far as I could tell, of 1976. The Star Force trilogy is a set of three games that all share the same relatively loose future history that was laid down by Redmond Simonson, who is also the designer of Star Force, which came out in 1974. So it's a pretty early game, and it's really one of the very early science fiction hobby games of any kind, to be completely honest about it. We are running really good on time, and my voice is absolutely trashed. So let's drink some water here. Abraxas MF, I believe that copy of the Star Force trilogy, is in the flat. So the individual games were all released in the flats. Both Star Force and Outreach were also released in 2-inch boxes. Star Soldier may have been as well, but if so, I have never seen it. I have only seen it in the flat or as part of the Star Force trilogy. Now, the Star Force Trilogy was released both in the flat and in the soapbox. So this is another one of those where there's multiple packagings even for the soapbox version of the game. Um, I've talked about this a fair amount in the past. I had this back in the day in the soapbox in the early 80s, and I'm not even sure where it came from, but I ended up with it. Um, and I played all three games, okay? But the game that I felt was the most interesting and compelling and had the most replay value was Outreach. Um, Star Force is interesting, but it's not super fun to play. It's simultaneous plotted movement on a star map that was kind of accurate at the time. Three-dimensional movement, by the way, I might add. You needed to run some logarithm tables or some shit to do the movement in this game. They did give you tables for that, so you didn't necessarily have to do the trigonometry, thankfully. But Matt Davidson says he has Star Soldier in the box. Awesome. Meandering Mike says that the Star Force trilogy in the flat trays is much cheaper, which is absolutely in line with my experience as well. Um, and Jeff Beeler says that the Star Force is the antithesis of Imperium, which came out about the same time. Yes, I'd agree with this, actually. Imperium, super important game, and I think a game that holds up really well. Star Force is a game that nobody would design nowadays. There's no doubt about that. I don't necessarily have a crystal clear idea of how I'm organizing this, but I suspect it's going to happen on setup cards, which means that right now I'm just throwing the counters in a tray. So Star Soldier was released in 77, designed by Tom Walchik. Outreach was released in 1976, designer Irad Hardy. And this is one of the reasons why I think that Hardy is a bit of an underappreciated designer. Because there's some really cool things in here. And for that matter, there's some really cool things in a couple of his other designs that I have seen. I can't necessarily say that I think they necessarily all hold together as I think, for example, I have a baggie here somewhere, right? War Between the States, I think, has some um let me put it this way. It is a game that basically works. However, I wouldn't call it problem free, but that it has some pretty significant flow problems, some play tempo problems that make it less fun than it might otherwise be, despite some really interesting other things going on there. We'll talk about that when we get to it. I'd love to have this in the soapbox again, but I do have a boxed copy of Star Force and a trade copy of Outreach, and I don't feel like I need Star Soldier all that badly. To me, Star Soldier was the least goddamn this thing was the least interesting of the three, and that may be because it was hard to see it. Remember, this is the early 80s, right? Several years later. It was hard to see it and not compare it to Starship Troopers, right? Um, I haven't played the new version. I played one of the previous versions. I can definitively say that the answer to this is no. Um, does it? You know, I'm not sure I remembered that actually. Jeff Beeler says it has all the Larry Niven known space planet names on it. That's kind of awesome, actually, if they did that and they got away with it. Um, Let me point this out. Actually, Perfidious Albion says what was funny about Operation Typhoon was when he opened it up and there was so much empty space. He wonders if the other soapbox games had a lot of empty space. This is actually true, and this was something I was intending to mention. And when I kind of did when I say this was kind of overkill packaging for games today, that is what I mean. Operation Typhoon, I would expect nowadays would come in a 2-inch box. I would not expect it to come in a 3-inch box, and I certainly wouldn't expect mounted maps. So from a like strictly space standpoint, yeah, there's generally a lot of air in these boxes. The ones that I think tend to get filled up relatively uh, tightly are things like War in Europe, War in the Pacific, because those are really genuinely huge games. Operation Typhoon is big, but it ain't that big. And a lot of these games fall into that category. Big, but not that big. I mean, this is me saying this, so I mean, bear that in mind. You know, all of these are except for the Art of Siege and maybe Mech War 2. Um, all of these are function and Conflict in American History. All of these are functionally monster games. Okay. And I guess the Star Force trilogy, because there's individual scenarios here. Although it's a bit of a project to play Outreach, to be honest about it. There is a decent amount of paperwork, but there's less paperwork than there was in well, at least I think a little bit. At least I remember it being a little bit less than in Stellar Conquest, for example. I think I need more counters. Um, I definitely need more counters. 5/8 inch counters in this, by the way. It's pretty nice. Um, Perfidious Albion says, one thing for sure, most recent soapbox games like Case Blue DAC were really packed. Now Compass Games, Steel Wolves. That's you know what? Mine's unpunched, and I haven't tried to. I haven't really even considered punching it, so I have not done none the necessary analysis to determine how many trays it would need. But it is a 3-inch box, and it is a pretty roomy box, so I would think that I could get it into 3 or 4 trays, and I believe I could fit 4 trays in that box plus all the other stuff. I think. But like I said, I haven't actually done measurements or anything like that on it. Oh, excellent. Mark Hodgkinson picked up Into the Woods um, on Australian eBay for $70 USD. That's pretty good. It's a pretty big game, but it's also pretty rich in scenario as well. So Joe Perez is talking about yes. So there's, as I said, there is sort of a loose future history that is shared by all three of these games. And one of the factions in that history is the Human League. And it has been confirmed by the band, the Human League, that is where they got their name. The band, whoops, I don't need to clip that. That's a blank. The band has admitted it. So this is not an urban legend. This is actually accurate. And I think the Human League gets mentioned in Outreach as well, but that's just a mention. It's actually one of the factions in Star Force. John C says that One Small Step's Holy Roman Empire has a lot of air in its 3.5-inch box. I have not handled that. I've seen it on a store shelf. So I don't know enough about it. Does it not have a mounted map? Because I had the impression that it did, but I might be wrong there. And as Meandering Mike points out, there are a couple of expansions. That's a good point. Good point. So when I had Battle for Normandy, I stored the pieces outside the box. Now I am reasonably sure that with a 3D printed solution, I could get everything in the box. But I'm there's going to be at least one of these games where I'm going to be wrong about it. I am having to make compromises with Case Blue, for example. I'm gonna do it, but I'm gonna make compromises to do it. John C says there's no mounted map in Holy Roman Empire. That is a Mark McLaughlin game. Jeff Beeler says, how about an Outreach game at Origins, Buckeye Game Fest, or Winterfest? You know what? I'll bring Outreach to Buckeye Game Fest. So I have a hotel reservation for Buckeye Game Fest, and I just made a hotel reservation for Origins, and my Origins hotel reservation is unfortunately like 10 miles away. That's unfortunate. It's going to be inconvenient, but I would rather deal with that than pay an additional $800 for the hotel, which is the difference that we would be looking at. So no, thank you. But BGF, I'm staying there. And frankly, I expect the Labatai guys to cash in at 7 o'clock. So I will be happy to have a running Outreach game if anybody wants to do that. So all I need to do is remember to bring it with me. It's punched and ready to go. All right. So I believe we've adequately. Let me have some scotch here. It is my preference, by the way, to drink Lefroy without water. Okay, so here's the original Star Force cover, or Star Force Alpha Centauri, as it's called sometimes. Star Soldier and Outreach. This is a fabulous cover, by the way. I love this cover, and I'm gonna Redmond Simonson credit that. I don't know that, but I believe that's probably linked to my Origins hotel. I don't even remember where it was. It's not right down there. For BGF, I'm staying at the Hyatt, but I got the convention rate at BGF. I don't have the convention rate at Origins because it's a pain in the ass, and I didn't want to deal with it. All right, number 12 should be number 13, but it's number 12. I'm not being cagey, Jeff. I just actually don't remember. It's like a Quality Inn or something like that. Next up is Terrible Swift Sword. This is Richard Berg design from 1976. This is the Big Daddy predecessor of the great campaigns of the American Great Battles. I don't do that often, but I just did it. Of the American Civil War series. I don't know if this actually came out first, but it does share most of the system with the early entries in the Great Battles of the American Civil War system. But there is some variation between those games as well. So it's a little bit of an oversimplification to say that they all use the same system. Jeff Beeler, yeah, maybe. Yeah, send me an email on that, and I'll actually give you the information. I'm happy to do that. It'll be cheaper, I can tell you that, and it's pretty cheap already. So, John C. When I finished organizing Triumph of Chaos Second Edition, I did not feel like it was incredibly spacious, but certainly it is errata riddled. That's absolutely true. It's a very troubled production. So this is, as Steve O points out, this is an iconic game. Okay, it's the Battle of Gettysburg. It's the whole Battle of Gettysburg. Like a lot of Gettysburg games, it has issues inherent to the situation of Gettysburg. Okay, so Gettysburg is a meeting engagement, right? And traditionally, you start a Gettysburg game right at the very beginning of the first day on July 1st. You've got, Harry Heath's guys against Buford's guys. And a lot of things if the players have complete freedom to make operational, grand tactical, whatever decisions in that space, then after that first day, the battle is almost certainly going to develop along radically different lines than it did historically. And maybe you're satisfied with that, and maybe you're not. There are some Gettysburg games that alleviate this problem. One way to do that is to have a day 2 scenario and a day 3 scenario, and that's fine. But if you want to play out the whole thing, you got to kind of think about what the battle looks like on day 2 based on what you did that differs from what the historical commanders did on day 1, right? Because the wargamers got more information than Robert E. Lee did. Even if the game is intentionally hiding stuff from you, you've got more information than Robert E. Lee did, which was a big part of the reason why the battle developed the way it did. There are also other games. Last Chance for Victory would be one, which include elements which some would call scripting. And I'm not even going to differ with that characterization, except that I think it's a little harsh because it's really, most of the scripting happens on the first day. And I didn't feel like it was an obnoxious level of scripting, right? So there's some things that is going to happen on the first day if you follow the script, and doing so is optional, by the way. So one of those things is that Reynolds is going to get killed. All right, you as the Union player can. So there's kind of two things going on in Last Chance for Victory on that first day. One is that Robert E. Lee is very restricted in what he can do because he has basically no information because his Jeb Stewart's out joyriding. So the Union player needs to kill Reynolds at some point on the first day, and there's a time limit as to when this needs to happen by. Now, bear in mind, you might decide you're not going to kill him, and he gets killed later anyway. That could happen. But if you do not kill him by the standard time of reckoning, then all the restrictions on Robert E. Lee are lifted. So it's not a super duper strict script, but it's scripting. Terrible Swift Sword does not really have any of that. Nor, for example, does its descendant 3 Days of Gettysburg. Now, I've never played the original, but I have played 3 Days of Gettysburg, and we enjoyed it a lot. I'm very pleased with my. That's interesting. I'm very pleased with my experience with 3 Days of Gettysburg. No, there usually Jeff. There usually isn't actually. Now there as in almost all these games, frankly, right? Even in many of the uncontested classics of SPI, a lot of these games got played so much that the players found the holes in them, right? So I almost said 3 Days of Gettysburg. Terrible Swift Sword is one of those things. People played it a lot. People found the holes in it, and there are potentially balance threatening things happening here, right? Here, yeah, this light's not really helping that much. I on the other hand, out in the game room, it's the light is better, so that could alleviate the problem. So I mean, he's got a good rating, right? I think the individual leader ratings are a little less important. So let me clarify what I mean by that. I think the individual leader ratings for the purposes of the chit pull system are less important in modern GBACW than you might think that they are. Now, there are other ratings that make a difference as well. But the big thing with Reynolds is that he's got a good, whatever the command rating is, to issue orders. And he's better than most of the other Union commanders at the time. Now, whether you think that's justified or not is kind of another. I need to turn that off. It's kind of another story. I'm a little less convinced of that, but it's maybe unfair to Reynolds, who did go out of his way to get himself killed at this battle too. So, I mean, this is something that can happen in a lot of Civil War games. It's the U.S. Civil War. Well, not U.S. Civil War. He gets killed in U.S. Civil War, but actually, I'm not sure he's in U.S. Civil War. He probably shouldn't be, as a. He might be in U.S. Civil War, but he's definitely in the Eric Lee Smith Civil War. He can absolutely survive in that. Alan Salazar asks, is A Most Fearful Sacrifice the last and best word on Gettysburg games? I'm going to say that I think for a lot of people, the answer is going to be yes. It is easy to play, but not unsophisticated. It is physically extremely well done. I really, really, really like Last Chance for Victory. And part of that is the package, right? The enormous volume of historical notes and scenarios and stuff like that. Now, to be fair, Most Fearful Sacrifice has a lot of scenarios as well. It's got a very good scenario selection, and so I think my tastes align a little more with Line of Battle than they do with the Black Swan system. Part of that is sort of a reservation that's not really rooted in anything real. Of the slightly de-emphasized scale of A Most Fearful Sacrifice, where it's kind of the scale is kind of between regiments and brigades. It's nominally regiments, but it's kind of like dual regiments in a lot of cases. That's not my preference. And so I think that's why I'm saying that. I think that's the biggest reason. That said, there's nothing wrong with that design choice either. That's merely a preference on my part. So John Longshore says Lee winning Gettysburg and Napoleon winning Waterloo is the same result. Can never win like that again. Pyrrhic Maximus. So the let's say, well, I think Napoleon wins Waterloo. I think that doesn't matter. I think there's just another battle when the Russians show up that he then loses, and maybe it's another. He can hang out for maybe another couple of months, at best. Um, I'm less convinced of that in the case of Gettysburg. If the Confederates can win a really decisive victory, in a big battle like that, then again, they did in a couple other places, right? The Confederates won a decisive victory at Chickamauga, for example. They won a decisive victory at both First and Second Manassas. Um, they won a decisive victory at, well, I guess decisive is the word I'm getting stuck on, actually, because none of those were actually decisive. They won a clear victory in all of those places. None of those proved to be decisive, and it's easy in retrospect to look back at Gettysburg and say that was the decisive moment. I'm less convinced of that than I am about a number of other things I've been less convinced about tonight. I think the fall of Vicksburg is just as big a deal as the victory at Gettysburg. Now, if Lee had done what Lee wanted to do, which was to destroy the Army of the Potomac, that I think that would have been decisive, but that literally never happened in the US in the American Civil War, and it was a Napoleonic triumph that they were after. And it didn't happen that often in the Napoleonic period either. Even Napoleon was not able to pull it off more than a few times. So, and even then there's nuance there that the Austrian and Russian armies were not destroyed after Austerlitz. It's just that they couldn't fight anymore. The Prussian army in 1806 was in fact destroyed. Um, that kind of thing never happened in the American Civil War. To a whole army. It came closest at Chickamauga. Generally, no, not in my experience, Perfidious Albion. He asks, do the rules in some Gettysburg games simulate Reynolds taking undue risk at the front, leading to his death? Generally, not. Generally, there is some kind of leader casualty mechanism, however. And um, convincing. Joe Perez says convincing. I do like that word. Um, the No, generally it's there. Most games are happy to just leave it up to the random mechanism. I mean, somebody's going to get killed, right? Might be Robert E. Lee. You never know. This is true, and in fact, um, corps commanders in general are not really needed in the front lines, generally speaking. So there's no really good reason to um there's no really good reason to put Reynolds in the front line in Three Dog, in my opinion. The brigade leaders you want up there, but Reynolds, probably not. John C confirms that Reynolds is in Mark Simonich's U.S. Civil War. So thank you, John. So John Stanley said Thomas did great damage to Hood's army at Nashville. This is actually a good point. That's more Hood's fault than well, I don't want to sound like I'm shortchanging George Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga, but Hood's foolishly aggressive behavior also resulted in large Confederate losses there as well. So Stigler might be right. I haven't played Red Badge of Courage, so it's on the list of things to do, along with all the other things to do. All right, so Terrible Swift Sword, very briefly, was available in the flat, was in the soapbox, was later reprinted by TSR in a 2-inch box. It's a pretty big game. In a 2-inch box with redone graphics that are not good, as we've discussed at length in the past. I'm not going to belabor the point. The original SPI maps are not the pinnacle of SPI maps or counters for that matter, but they're okay for the time. The TSR maps are really, really, really ugly. On the other hand, you're not going to get confused as to what terrain you're looking at. So there's that. And then the next iteration of this would be 3 Days of Gettysburg from GMT, which has itself been through 3 editions. And there's a 4th that will be along at some point. Stigler would know more about that than I do, but I don't know that he's got an actual calendar on it either. Next up is this is probably of the whole catalog of soapboxes. This is probably the one I don't have that I want the most, although We'll get to my top 5 soapboxes at the end. Um, this is the Battle of the Bulge. It's kind of the quintessential monster game of the Battle of the Bulge. It's on 4 maps. It's a battalion level game. It is not the same game as the Decision Games Vok Dam Rhine, which is a Joe Youst design. This is credited to Jim Dunnigan, developers Joe Balkowski and Jay Nelson. I think there's some interesting things going on here, and furthermore, this system has been adapted later on, and I forget where that happened. But this system was picked up later on to cover a different topic as well. In Pizza Frenzy Man says there are more Manassas games than Gettysburg games. Are we counting both battles though? I mean, maybe that's why. If you think about it, because there's a first Manassas and a second Manassas, and they're not always in the same box. There are games that cover one or the other. So having now played the Decision Games reimagining, I kind of like to try the original, and it's the same type of situation as Atlantic Wall, where I really kind of want to see what the original had going on as well. This is another one where people played it a lot. People found the holes. There's some problems with it. I have no doubt that that's an accurate statement. The counters are kind of late period counters that don't look that good. Huge gutters on them to alleviate potential registration problems. That's a thing that SPI did, Victor Games did, Avalon Hill did to some extent, but Avalon Hill was generally better because they could at least control that in house, even though they largely didn't. This is a 1977 release, by the way. So I'd really kind of like to see what this has going for it. It's relatively easy to find in the flat. It's less easy to find in the soapbox. Jeff Mueller is right. SPI did have a limited palette of colors, especially considering they started doing this shit in like 1968. So, or maybe it was 69 or 70, but it was still really early. So they were lucky when they had 4 colors, right? TSR started in 1974, started including color later, and had access to a lot more graphically sophisticated stuff in terms of printing than in the 80s than SPI had in the 70s. So that's true, and I think we should consider that. And I don't think Vok Dam Rhine is a terrible looking game necessarily, but the counters, the important stuff on the counters is smaller than I would like. Let me put it that way. I don't know that the problem with Stigler says that TSR had 0 design sense or skill. They managed to make the beautiful Antietam battlefield look like the Marne. Horrible. It is horrible. I don't even think the problem is that it looks like the Marne. I think the problem is it looks like the surface of Mars. I think the color palette is ghastly. I think it's aesthetically displeasing. Let me put it that way. Again, it's functional. Can use it? Sure. But I would have preferred the SPI graphics because they're nicer, frankly. So Perfidious Albion. So I don't want to spend, I guess we're doing great on time. So, I guess I'll give you some Gauss thoughts here, right? So having now just spent a whole week playing the Gauss Vok Dam Rhine, it's a completely different system. Again, I suspect that you like with Atlantic Wall, you'll be able to see some concepts that made it into Gauss, right? But Gauss it's a very complicated system. It requires a lot of bookkeeping in terms of doing the logistics, which requires a fair amount of bookkeeping. In terms of managing, because every unit can be broken down, but then you have to know what did this generic infantry company, what battalion did that come from? You got to write that down. You can assign and reassign formations or parts of formations to other higher level units. That's great that you can do that, but it is 100% manual process. There's no play aids to help you with that. There's no mechanisms to help you with that. You just got to write it all down, and then just remember that that's the case when it's time to move one of those units, that it's got to stay with, 5th Fallschirmjäger rather than staying with whatever Volksgrenadier division, for example. So I think the Battle of the Bulge, one of the reasons why, I think there's a couple reasons why it's a perennially popular topic. One of those is that it's got built, it's a cultural touchstone for Americans who know something about World War II history. Okay, so I think that's the most important thing. Another is that I think it's actually a fairly gameable situation. On the strategic level, the German plan is absurd. There's no way it can succeed. But in terms of compartmentalizing that into a battle, decent victory conditions in a Battle of the Bulge game can create a situation where it is possible for the Germans to win, right? Um, since they're not getting to Antwerp because that's ridiculous, it's not necessarily going to be that they destroy the American forces or anything like that, or have a clear breakthrough over the Marne or anything like that. Uh, but you tend to be able to gauge success fairly easily off of a comparison to the historical results. So I think it's a pretty gameable situation. It also has, kind of a back and forth where, there's the Germans are on the offensive at the beginning, and the Americans are probably counterattacking locally on a game of this scale, but probably not very much. A week into the campaign, the Americans are going to be attacking like hell. And we got a long way into the game. We got like 8 or 9, maybe 10, and we got about 8 days of gameplay in 8 days. So, um, Steve O says that Goss is more work than fun. A pass for him, and I can't argue with this. It is a substantial amount of work. I think it's a pretty rewarding system. I think there's things that it does that I really like. I really like the way and some of those are really relatively simple things, right? Like the way the movement works. I think that's really cool. But it is very much, and I know I've used this term before, and I'm not sure I've used it on this show, of simulation by minutia. Okay, where there is literally a little special rule for everything. Okay, there's rules for the weight capacity on the bridges, for example. There's rules for the Greif teams, which every Bulge game has a rule for the Greif teams, I suppose. Um, but there are rules for all of that. So I'd kind of like to see the less complicated version, right? And this is one of the longer rule books that SPI did, right? This is a fairly beefy rule book, and I haven't read the whole rule book, so I don't know how much of it's rules versus scenarios or whatever. But there's kind of a lot going on here, but by the standards of the day. Um, Stigler says Bulge is similar to Market Garden. Yeah, this is true. I mean, again, you look at it strategically, and it's not going to make a difference in the outcome of the war. But you can absolutely construct the game such that the situation presents itself with its own victory conditions that are relevant to play. So totally doable. Jeff Beeler mentions battles for the Ardennes, has 4 different victory scenarios for the Germans to try for, including heading south to beat up on Patton. I'm sure Patton would have hated that. I will say that we were also playing Last Blitzkrieg right now, and frankly, I feel like we're having a better. I'd like to be able to play Last Blitzkrieg. God damn it! At a convention in a convention format where we can like stick with it for several days at a time, as opposed to playing in 3-hour increments once a week. I'd really like to do that. I'd really like to do some BCS convention play. It's not going to happen in the first half of this year, I can tell you that. But maybe at Compass Expo, we'll see. Whichever one of those I end up going to. So yes, Last Blitzkrieg is excellent, and frankly, I think I enjoyed playing Vakdam Rhine in Goss, but it's a very challenging system. It's a lot to deal with, and it's a bit exhausting to play, more so than BCS. So that's that. So I would with caveats for both, I would say I'd find it more easy to recommend Last Blitzkrieg to somebody now than Decisions Vakdam Rhine. So I'm trying. It's the camera. I got to stop squirming around. That's the problem. War Between the States. It's an Irad Hardy design, 1977. This was also released in both the flat and the soapbox. Now I've played this. I've played the decision version, which is not meaningfully different from the SPI version. In fact, Decision was so kind as to include all of the original mistakes, rather than including the errata that had addressed those mistakes in 1978. So Uh, Jeff Beeler points out that the Bulge was definitely decisive for the guy in charge of the 106th U.S. Infantry Division. So that's definitely true. Okay, so War Between the States. This is another one of those Irad Hardy designs that I feel like Irad Hardy maybe doesn't get as much attention as he deserves. So this inherits, like War in the Pacific, which he also had a hand in. This inherits some stuff from War in Europe. Okay, the production spiral makes a reappearance here, for example. But there's a really interesting production mechanism where you have like production points and then manpower, and it takes both to make units. And you will run out of manpower and will have to do additional recruitment drives and things like that, additional drafts in the case of the Union, which lowers overall Union morale. I think that's really neat the way that works. Unusually for a game at something like a similar scale, and I take that with a grain of salt because there's very little on this scale, right? The closest thing to this scale is probably there really isn't. I mean, you got U.S. Civil War, you've got War for the Union, and you've got the Victory Game Civil War, all of which are at a roughly similar scale. But you could fit those on one map. This is a 3-map game. So there's some really interesting things going on here. However, the turns are, I'm going to get the terminology wrong in this. So bear in mind for the people, it's hard to directly compare for the people because the units are generic strength points and the map is a point-to-point map. So it's hard to make a comparison. But that said, for the people is not hugely different in scale from the other 3 games I just mentioned. It's quite different from this. And you can absolutely see the influence of this, I think, in Eric Lee Smith's Civil War, because there's some U.S. Civil War is a 2-mapper, but they're big counters and big hexes as well. So the there's some tempo problems with this, right? So the way the leader activations work is that there's a chit pull mechanism, but you're like drawing a random number from a cup, and it's just a number. And that is the number of like free activations. Again, I'm going to get this terminology messed up. That's like the number of free activations or automatic activations you can take, right? And the pool changes as the game goes on, and that number, the higher and higher numbers become available, so you can move large numbers of forces. But for the first 2 years, it's possible to, like through the end of 1962, as I recall, it's possible to get 0. And I drew 0 an uncanny number of times. Okay. So there's that. You just because you didn't get the free activations doesn't mean you can't activate anybody, but there's a leadership rating on the counter. And in order to activate, you have to roll the leadership number or less. Okay. So McClellan is a 1. All right. Now, there's kind of 2 dimensions to this. So, in order to activate a leader to move, you have to get an activation. So it's like, unless I spend a free activation on McClellan, he has to roll to move. He only actually gets to move on a 1 out of 6. Okay. Now that you've moved, in order to engage the enemy in combat, you have to again roll against that leadership rating. And it's the same rating. McClellan is a 1 out of 6 chance. So to get McClellan to engage is you got to basically roll boxcar or snake eyes, right? You need to roll a 1, and then on the engagement roll, you got to roll a 1 again. This works. This creates a tempo that produces reasonable results at the end. However, it makes it less engaging to play than it might otherwise be because these leaders are idle most of the time. These especially low-level Union leaders in the early part of the war, you tend to be kind of bored because there's just you can't activate anybody, right? You get, I got 0 points again, so I can't activate anybody, and I can roll for McClellan, but I got to roll twice. You got to roll 1 twice in a row to actually get him to actually do anything. Now, does that have a historical basis? Sure. And again, that's fine too. It works. It makes sense. It produces reasonable results. Although there's like a bunch of conditional things that will cost you victory points in the game, and you got to pay close attention to that. If you don't pay close attention to that, you will get fucked on the victory points. Um, it is reasonable, but it creates an unfun play tempo. And that I think is the bigger problem in the game. I would have preferred some kind of activation pulses roll where you have a somewhat random turn length and you can keep rolling against him and keep failing maybe. But then maybe you get fatigue or something like that. I mean, there's other ways I think that could have been handled, and I was left a little bit unsatisfied. But I think this is basically a pretty good game. Um, so S&T 43 U.S. Civil War. That's called the American Civil War, as I recall, for clarity. And it was if it's the game I'm thinking of, and there's been a couple different games with that or very similar titles over the years in S&T. But the old SPI American Civil War that was in S&T was redone by decision maybe 5 years ago or so. And again, I don't know. You'd have to do your own legwork on that. Might be identical to the SPI version. It might be complete redesign. You never know until you look. So it's not just McClellan though, and it's not even just the Union. The Confederates got a decent number of bums as well, and they're just as likely to get a zero statistically anyway, as the Union player in those first year and a half. So Ray Garby, thanks for stopping by, much appreciated. All right, so after War Between the States, War in the East. Now, there's a War in the East first edition, which I want to say was a 75 or 76 release. Okay. And this is the second edition. Now, there's three different versions, technically four different versions of War in the East that SPI did. Okay. There's the original first edition. Okay. Which is, again, it's a year or two earlier than this 1976 release. Okay. There's War in the East, as you see it here. There's a flat version and there's a boxed version. This is the only game in a soapbox that was also part of another soapbox. Okay. Um, so it's kind of unique in that respect, but it came on a soapbox of its own. Um, and then it was bundled in with War in Europe at roughly the same time, right? That's also got a 1976 date. So unless BGG is getting the dates wrong, I didn't check dates on all this stuff. Then um, these were released at roughly the same time. So as I recall, this is a 3-map game. The map layouts between the first and second edition of War in the East are significantly different, and the game systems themselves are quite revised. If you're going to run a copy of War in the East down, I would suggest the second edition. I am not sure that that's worthwhile. There's some weird artifacts in I guess we'll talk about the weird artifacts when we get to War in Europe. In the meantime, let's move on because the next one is in fact War in Europe. Okay. Now, what this was again was released in a flat, was released in a soapbox, and was basically just War in the East, War in the West put together. War in the West was also released in 1976. So here's War in the East again. Here's War in the West. War in the East completes the map of War in the West, completes the map of Europe, and gives you a mostly the same, but sometimes slightly different version of the system with which to play out the war in the West and North Africa, by the way. There's a number of interesting quirks here. This may be the first game to include a production spiral. Wouldn't be surprised. A War in the East. I've heard conflicting things about whether War in the East first edition had a production spiral or not. Let me put it that way. But War in the East second edition definitely did. The Germans and the Russians on the East Front use the production spiral, so they actually have production that they do. The Western Allies, on the other hand, use a reinforcement schedule. That's weird. I think I can justify that, but it's weird, and I think takes some fake control out of the hands of the Western Allied player, I suppose. I'm not sure I even noticed that. I'm probably gonna get demonetized because of this shit. Thanks, Redmond Simonson. Um, so just checking up on the great John C. Fremont. Oh my god, what a bum that guy was. Worse than McClellan. Much worse than McClellan, actually. Okay, so we're in Europe. This is one I've also played literally over my shoulder. I think it's a very solid game. Again, people played these a lot. People found the holes. There's holes, and there's strange artifacts that are features results of the game's scale. So if you've ever seen this played, you'll have seen, if you get into say late 42, you'll have seen the like 6 to 8 hex deep fronts that you have on the east front. That's kind of ridiculous, but it's an artifact of the scale and the historical frontages and the stacking limits and a number of other factors that result in that being seen, right? um Ultimately, maybe it should be a subdivisional level game, right? Or a core level game at that scale. It's 20 miles to the hex, by the way. The whole of Europe is on 7 maps. That sounds right. I think that's correct. Perfidious Albion, you're going to be very disappointed in just a minute. Um, so I think it's a good game. I think there's things you could do with it to improve it. Now, Wizards of the Coast, Jesus Christ, the only company less respected than Decision Games in the hobby space right now. Decision did a redone War in Europe with updated graphics. They did make some changes. They did not completely redesign it. They did make some changes. I am told that those changes were generally positive changes. I don't have that. It goes for a giant pile of money that I am totally unwilling to pay. So even though this was released at what was an obscene amount of money at the time, and it's an enormous game. Obviously, it's one of the biggest war games ever produced, and it was definitely the biggest war game ever produced when it was produced. Um, so it's actually easier. I think it's easier to find a copy of the SPI version than it is the Decision version. So not only have I seen it on a table, I have played at that table. So um, Decisions of the Coast, as Manders puts it, which is pretty good, actually. I like that very much. Meandering Mike lists 9 maps. That might be right, too. Maybe it's War in the Pacific that's the 7 maps. That sounds right, actually, thinking about it. So solid game. Kind of expensive to run it down. I got a deal on it, so I'm happy to have it. It was, of course, the game that went flying when during the move, so I had to pick pieces up out of the carpet. I think I got them all. Not sure. Think I got them all. Um, so worth a look and definitely an experience to play. And if you don't want to deal with the whole thing, you can always just play War in the West. There are scenarios for that whereby you can play out parts of it. Next up is oh, design credits on this are Ed Curran, Jim, and this is in the book. I checked this one. Ed Curran, Jim Dunnigan, Ired Hardy, and Tom Walchik. And I'm not sure who did what. Okay. So taking that at face value, this borrows, it does not use the same system as War in Europe, but it does borrow a decent amount from War in Europe. It is, as I recall, 7 maps, which are interestingly noteworthy because they are printed on a blue paper, which is weird. But it makes sense because most of the map is open ocean, right? But this thing runs all the way to India too. So it's got a huge scope. It's got a very interesting looking logistics system. Um, I picked this up. This was, until I bought Second Front, the most expensive single war game I had ever bought, and I was disappointed when my unpunched copy arrived with one missing counter, just out of the sheet. But I managed to find a guy um, on one of the Facebook groups that had extra counters, and I managed to obtain that one Japanese brigade that I was missing. The World War One, I didn't count this because it wasn't in the soapbox. It was a separate thing that was available in the flat. Was the World War One kit for War in Europe, which was basically uh garbage. Didn't work. All accounts are that it's just busted. Doesn't really work. There is somebody. I don't want to say who without because I don't know if they're ready to announce it yet. There is somebody looking at revisiting that idea, which I think is a very interesting idea. Um, yes, there was actually. It was in Fire. Was it Moves or Fire and Movement? I want to say it was in Moves magazine. There were articles on how to link the two. But there's not. I wouldn't call that a robust rule set, and it's very much a situation where you are playing the two games in parallel, right? Rather than really them impacting each other much, because the scale's different for one thing. The unit scale is different. Um, so I mean, there's a decent idea there in hey, I love this World War II game. Let's make a World War One game on the same maps. I mean, Fatal Alliances did that. You could get it in a standalone now from Compass, but for years that was just a kit with an overlay that you'd put on your World in Flames map. But that system works better for World War One than I think War in Europe does. Um, Interesting. So this is not what the book says, but I'll take Greg Kostikian's word for it over what the book says. Um, yeah, that's pretty much what I said, actually. Developers Tom Walchick and John Callowar. Callowar? I don't know how the hell you pronounce that. Um, yeah, those are the four people that are listed in the book as game designers for this thing. So this is, it's got a detailed logistics system. That's actually what I think is interesting about it. They admitted, by the way, that this thing did not get play tested in total. They play tested the Guadalcanal scenario, which is a one map scenario. So there's a way to do this without necessarily eating the entire 7 map footprint and probably 300 or 400 hours of gameplay to do it. It's a decent looking game considering the slightly weird blue print paper with the maps. Um, the the ship counters do not have the ship names on them, which I don't like. They have the pennant numbers, and then there's a table on one of the player aids that you can use to look what ship it is. But unless you want to memorize the pennant numbers, and I don't, then you don't know that it's the Enterprise or the Yamato or whatever, right? So interesting game. Happy to have it. I'd like to get it played at some point. That is likely when it happens to be the Guadalcanal scenario. And then if I think it's awesome, then I'll be positioned to see say it's awesome, and we can play the whole thing if we want to. I mean, that would be cool. But I think generally you want large, detailed Pacific War game. I'd send people to Pacific War in a heartbeat over this nowadays, frankly. Meandering Mike says he used the War in Europe maps to play his own homebrew Viking raiding game. That sounds awesome, actually. They were all over the place. All right, the last SPI soapbox is Wellington's Victory. This Frank Davis game from 1976. Now, Frank is super modest about this game, but folks I talk to seem to generally have a fairly high opinion of it. Its rating on BGG is quite respectable. Now, again, this is a game that people played a lot and they found holes in it, and there's holes in it, right? The big complaint about this one seems to be the way that the skirmishers work. But there's also an asymmetric sequence of play, which apparently works really well. I think it's safe to say that this was an influential design. There were, even in just limiting oneself to the SPI period, there were two other games that were released by SPI, including the very last game that SPI. I guess I don't know this, but it's the last S&T game in S&T. I think 90 or 91, the Battle of Monmouth. The other one is Ney versus Wellington. That also uses the Wellington's victory system. Perfidious Albion. This is a great question because for years, decades even, I never saw this outside of the flat or the TSR version. And in fact, the one I have is the TSR version. I have since confirmed that it was available in the Soapbox. It seems to be very hard to find in the Soapbox, even more so than some of the other ones that are also hard to find in the Soapbox. But I have actually confirmed that. That was I would see it listed on lists of SPI soapboxes, and then I'm like, I've never seen that. I've seen every other one, including Conflicts in American History, and I've never seen that in a soapbox. But it does exist. I have seen it in pictures. I have not seen it in person or handled it with my greasy little hands. So, but yes, that's a great question. Okay, so this let me address this a couple of different ways. So TSR redid this. It's another one like with Terrible Swift Sword, where they weren't able to salvage or recover the original graphics. So they redid the graphics, and it looks terrible. It looks terrible, terrible, terrible. The SPI original again is not the pinnacle of SPI graphic design, but it's not horrific or wretched. And you know, you do get to cut some slack for it being 1976. Um, so I'd love Mike Mandering. Mike says someone is putting together a full Wellington's victory scale, including Quattrobra, Lindy, and Wav. Meandering Mike, I would love to know who that is, but I have a suspicion that I know who that is or was, and I'll get to that in a second. So TSR reproduced this again in a 2-inch box. It's still a pretty big game. It's got like 1,600 counters. Okay, with a hideous map and center nibs on the counters. The counters are okay for TSR counters from like 1985, but they do have center nibs. They'll need to be cut out of the sprues, right? And if I play this thing, I'm probably just going to play the TSR version. Decision Games redid this. It was a substantial redesign, and it was not well received. Let me put it that way. They were talking big plans for this to include additional battles using the system, including Austerlitz and Quattrobra that I have seen. If you look at the games in the Wellington's victory system on BGG, you'll notice 2 games that with no dates on them. They're both listed under decision. Austerlitz and Quattrobra. Those got shit canned when their version of Wellington's victory did not do well. Now, I think that's a bit of a shame, but the good news is that the upcoming Winter's victory, which should be out sometime around mid-year from New England Simulations, will revisit the Wellington's victory system as well. And if somebody is going to now, Mike, I'd love a link to that. If you want to send me the link to that, I will be happy to share that. Because that would be I'd like to see it. If it's just an individual, then cool. I'll be happy to share the love on that. Because I think that would be cool. Now, it is an interesting system and one that it's hard for me to say whether it would apply to other battles or not without having played the thing first, right? Just says, yes, we were all stunned by the news. It got floated on our list of things to play a couple years ago, and so I looked into it because it's like, oh, somebody wants to play. It was Fucko, I think, wanted to play Wellington's victory, and that's why I started looking into the reception of it. I'm like, yeah, this isn't looking good. So we ended up playing War Between the States instead, which I did find to be a rewarding experience that I do not regret at all. Meandering Mike, if don't kill yourself doing this, but if you happen to find it, shoot it to me, and I'll be happy to take a look. The maps were better. The counters, I didn't really. This is the decision version. The maps were nice. The counters, I didn't really care for particularly. I don't know if it's a completely different game, but it's a largely different game, and I do think it's fair to characterize it as a redesign, and as a disappointment to those who are waiting for it. And of course, it's an expensive game. I believe they still have copies and will probably be buried with them. Stigler says it's best realized in Vassal. You can launch the full battle in 5 seconds and avoid the setup. That's certainly a good selling point. Um, Colin Flanagan asked, Wargaming on the fictional character of Sharp British Rifleman. Harry Flashman makes an appearance in 3 Days of Gettysburg. I can tell you that. TSR Wellington's victory does in fact have synonyms. I think I said that. Maybe I didn't. So I've got I have pre-ordered Winter's Victory. By the way, it looks gorgeous. It's been in development for a long time. I have the highest level of faith in New England Simulations that they are going to release a solid product. And confidence is high. Okay, and that's I think they're talking about June, approximate shipping in June or something like that. Okay. And you can still get the pre-order price. So if you're interested, go get it now, right? Um, I think you can get the pre-order price through the end of the month or sometime late this month. So there are 4 actual games in either published or about to be published using the Wellington's Victory system. Wellington's Victory itself, and I'm going to count the TSR version as just a new printing of the original Wellington's Victory, and the Decision version as a completely different game. I'm gonna side with Stigler on this particular one. Ney versus Wellington and the Battle of Monmouth, American Revolution, obviously. Now I've got all 3. Okay, I've got the TSR version of Wellington's Victory and the 2 S&T games. The Monmouth was the last game that S&T produced. So my copy of Monmouth has grotesquely misregistered counters. So I would consider it, unless I want to make replacement counters for it, which I could do, but it's a pain. I would just as soon not punch it, because I maybe try and find a vassal module for it if I want to do Monmouth. But I'm considerably more interested in Napoleonic topics than American Revolution topics. So if I'm going to try the system out, I may try and pitch Winter's Victory later this year, depending on timing, depending on when we finish playing Last Blitzkrieg, or I may bust out Ney versus Wellington on my own. So the chances of that making an appearance in some capacity later on down the line is pretty high. I didn't hate the map that bad. It would have been worse if TSR had done it. I can tell you that. So, all right. So that is all of the SPI soapboxes. So before I get to my top 5, I will say, what do we have on deck for this week? We have the stream with Dan tomorrow at 7:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That is, or is it daylight time now? Fuck. That doesn't make any sense. I hate daylight savings time. So Eastern time, it's 7:30 p.m. Eastern time. It's on Dan's channel this week. On Wednesday, I'm pretty sure I'm getting this right. We have the after action report from the Goss Vuk dem Rhein game. It's about 6 minutes long, so it's not a huge watch. So be sure and watch that if you're interested in that at all. And on Thursday, we have the unboxing of Russian Campaign Deluxe 5th Edition from GMT. It is very nice. I do complain in the video about one thing, basically, and that is that they sell mounted maps, but there's not enough room in the box for the mounted maps. We could have gotten another 15 millimeters, and we could have had enough room for a counter tray and the mounted maps in that box, and they didn't do that. So they have done 2.5-inch boxes in recent memory. Barbarossa Army Group Center 2nd Edition is a 2.5-inch box. It's a weird size, but they can do it. I appreciate that they give you the option of mounted maps or no mounted maps. But if you're going to get the mounted maps, then the box should have enough room for that. On the other hand, then it'd be more shelf space. So, I mean, they're not going to print 2 different boxes. That'd be ridiculous. Joe Perez says that the Ney versus Wellington map was worse when the first batch arrived from the printer. Forgot to include, one of the color overlays in the whole batch was blue and gray. Oh, dear. Oh, dear. That's fantastic. Joe Perez, these are fabulous anecdotes, by the way. So I picked it up. I owned it before and then traded it away or gave it away a couple of years ago and then said, fuck, that was dumb. And I got it again. Same deal with Napoleon's Art of War, which is Eylau and Dresden, which I believe is the same system used in the Napoleon at War quad. Now, that is going to be a scale that is roughly the same as Napoleon's last battles. So brigade division type of scale. more interested in the tactical at this exact moment, but I'm going to waffle back and forth on that. Now, before we get to Navy versus Wellington, yes, the S&T game. S&T 70, 80 something like that. It was pretty late S&T late SPI era S&T, let me put it that way. I was happy to read the article online about who won the Oscars. I didn't stay up for shit. So, okay. So bear in mind that my selection here is going to be weighted on the games that I know more about. Okay. So, if hypothetical Bloody April were a brilliant masterpiece, I might not know that because I've never really looked at a copy. I almost bought one some years ago and it did not occur for whatever reason. Alexander Fontaine Rousseau, we're delighted to spend your money. So the game looks nice though, doesn't it? Doesn't it? Yeah, it really does. Really interested in seeing that. Really interested in seeing Empire and Glory as well. Since they're both battalion level games, right? Battalion level Napoleonics. But so, I'm going to say 5 games and if you ask me again in a year or hell even a week maybe, I might give you 5 completely different answers. So my top 5 more or less in ascending order, so number 5 is probably War in the Pacific. I think it's got some obvious issues and definitely wasn't play tested well, but it was play tested at least a little, so there's that. It's also got some fascinating concepts in it and I'd love to try it. Number 4 is probably Atlantic Wall. Again, I'm very interested in the topic, very interested in playing out, say, the landings in that system and seeing how they work and how the rest of the system works. I have not had the time to do that, even though I took the time to pull out the Omaha scenario counters, which at least those are all in there. Number 3 is War in Europe, which I have played and which I think one has those who have played War in Europe will, I think, whether they have complaints about it, the way it plays or not, or rules issues or whatever, will uniformly say that it was an unforgettable experience, right? It is an experience. This is why anybody plays Europa anymore, because there are a million reasons to complain about the system. But at the end of the day, it's about the experience. And War in Europe delivers on that experience. Rules, problems, and holes and exploits or not. Number 2 is, which one have I not done yet? Operation Typhoon. I listed them, but not in order. Groundbreaking game, fascinating game, great topic, by the way. Excellent chance of actually getting that to a table. And I think I may end up preferring that iteration of the variable strength mechanic over the Victory in the West variation on that same mechanic. So happy to have picked that up in just the last 6 months or so, actually. And I think I paid about $100 for it, which for a soapbox in decent shape ain't bad. I believe one lower box corner was blown and I had to repair it. I might be thinking of something else, actually. Now I feel like I'm thinking of something else. Maybe not. No, I repaired one of these corners. Top box, though. But it's in good shape. I'm happy to have it. It's pretty yellowed, though. I'm going to feel bad for not including the next war, but it's because it's my list and I'm not interested in that topically very much. That's why it's not on my list. I think in a more objective list, I think next war would rank higher than I'm ranking it. Number 1 is Terrible Swift Sword, which I have never played, but it is the game that's literally still alive, right? That has literally been reprinted or redone really relatively recently, and which is going to get another revival at some point. It's probably not even going to be too long. So I think that's probably, of the soapboxes, I think it's probably the one that I think holds up the best. All of these games are at least 40 years old. All of these games are are over 40, but not 50 years old. Let me put it that way. Um, the soapbox window was something like 1976 to 1982. Okay, and bear in mind it's very early 1982. It's February 1982 when SPI gets seized by TSR, as it were. All right, so Steve O agrees. I am glad that somebody agrees with me. That's always nice. Certainly, my wife doesn't agree with me often enough. Um, in closing, we have gone through a subset of the various artifacts of SPI's history in the 70s. Okay, these are 70s up to 1980 games, pretty much. I don't know that they did one in 1981. Didn't see one in 1981. In fact, the only 1981 was NATO Division Commander, which is another one that maybe is really innovative, but don't. I'm not interested in it topically. Um, so I am not like endorsing, oh, you've got to run out and get these. These are artifacts. If you really want to dig into a particular topic, and some of these games are like Terrors of Sword are landmark games, maybe you do want to check it out. But generally speaking, I think you'll be better served by looking at modern games that deal with these same topics. So if you want ILAO, for example, I'm going to say, hey, check out Winner's Victory, or go check out, unfortunately, the Library of Napoleonic Battles game that includes ILAO is The Coming Storm, which is not in print at the moment, but they are bringing it back. Steve O, thanks so much. Much appreciated. What is my next Monday topic? What is my next Monday topic? Do I have a plan? Is there a plan? Yeah, I think we're doing so. The topic for next week was the one that I mentioned last week, and in the in the process of saying it out loud, I realized that it was going to be a fucking disaster. So I'm not going to do that. I'm still working on the topic for next week. It might look something like the top rated war games or something like that, but we'll see. And I am kind of trying to. I love to keep people in suspense and all. I'm a big believer in that, but I am kind of trying to let people know what the topics are going to be as well. So, just at a glance here, how have we done tonight? We had a top number of just under 150, which is pretty good. I have no reason to be embarrassed by that. So, I would like to thank everybody for stopping by. Thanks very much for the commentary and the support. And we kind of tried. We had a pretty interactive show tonight. There's a number of like skills that I'm working on in that respect, as far as interacting with the chat, like the habit of reading the person's comment before I comment on the comment. I did a little better at that tonight. Not so good at pulling the things up on the chat. So there's that. Also, we have this would be a short ass list, wouldn't it? So I would like to thank everybody for coming by. The Best of Decision Games, also a very short list. Solitaire War Games. I mean, I got no particular problem with Solitaire War Games. I have an entire shelf and a half almost of Solitaire War Games. So, and that's after having pared back on Solitaire War Games, because I figured I wasn't going to do much in the way of Solitaire War Games. So I'm not a Solitaire War Game guy as such, though. So I would much rather send you over to Mike at My Own Worst Enemy, or any of several other solid, or Wayne over at Wayne Hansen's. Wayne Hansen, he does almost all solitaire stuff. I would rather you go to those folks that do a lot of solitaire stuff than me try and stumble around in that space. So I am unlikely to cover that. That said, I am happy to entertain as topic requests. Yaquinto, I think that'd be a pretty short list too. But Battle Line, on the other hand, is a possibility. So we'll see what we cover next week. Once again, like the video. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. If you're enjoying the show, share the video around. That's cool too. I'm always happy to have that. That helps to support the channel. If you'd like to do a little more, please check out the links to the Patreon in the notes below. So much appreciated, everybody. I need an outro. I was going to work on that over the weekend, and it just didn't happen. So I'm just going to keep waving until it says we're off the air. Hold on, we'll do the Queen wave. There we go. There we go. Everybody have a great night. We'll see you next week or tomorrow if you want to check me out with Dan.